vinyl planks that I'm using are a little under 4 feet long and just under 8 3/4 of an inch wide. You don't want a super short board at the beginning or end of a row. And you don't want a narrow run at the end of your installation either. Make a 3D model of the room and lay out the planks exactly how you want them beforehand. You can map out and stagger the seams and play around with the different layouts based on the bump outs in the room to see how it's all going to look. I pried up the transition piece between the current vinyl sheet floor and the carpet. Then I cut back the carpet to make room for the new transition strip, which is a metal channel. I used a sample piece of the flooring as a spacer, and I undercut the door jamb with flush cut saw. And on the baseboards, I'll cover those gaps with quarter round that I took off earlier. I cut the other side of the door too, and I cut into the baseboard a bit so that I could slide the flooring cleanly under the whole jamb. I positioned the channel so that my finished transition piece would just hit the middle door stop. Then I secured it to the floor with screws. And during my layout, I decided to take 2.5 inches off the width of my initial starter row. And this will give me 2.5 more inches of width on the other side of the room to avoid those narrow strips that I mentioned earlier. So I went ahead and grabbed my T-square to score the plank between my two marks. I quickly realized that scoring and snapping for the long cuts is not a great option. Then I used a circular saw to cut the line, and it turned out great. The vinyl plank is a floating floor, and it needs to be held off the walls 1/4 inch in all the directions. So to do this, I used these wedge spacers from the flooring install kit. I laid down the first plank under the door jamb, and the next piece gets dropped in and locked into that first piece. And using a tapping block across the front on the seam aligns the boards flush with each other. I measured the gap to the wall and I transferred it over to the board. Then I used a 12-inch carpenter square to score a line on the plank with my utility knife. To finish the cut, I flipped it over and cut through the backing to release the piece. Use this small pull bar that hooks over the end of the board and helps you pull that into place using a mallet. Connecting the boards from here on out is pretty easy. You just angle the tongue on the long edge into the groove of the row before it. And then you lower the plank and tap it into place using this tapping block from that kit that I mentioned earlier. At the end of this row, I had a really small cut to make off the end to make my board fit. And you can't really score it and snap it because it's just too short, so go ahead and use a circular saw for this as well. So when I came in to grab a board, I'd rotate through them so that the similar planks weren't close to each other. I laid out the plank and I transferred marks where the door jamb was and how much I needed to take off. As you're working through the room, you can start using some of the offcuts from one end of the room to start or finish the other end of the room. And when I got to the bump out on the other side of the room, I measured and marked the planks for the notch. And this corner was way out of square, so I made sure to measure at the beginning and the end of each side of that notch. Now another little surprise in the install was this overflow drain in the floor. I measured the distance off the side of the cabinet and off of the back wall and marked the plank. Then I used a Forstner bit a little bit larger than that pipe in the floor. And next I laid the board in place and I finished the row before putting an extension onto that drain. I just marked and cut a 1.5 inch to 1 1/4 inch PVC downpipe to length, and then I installed it just below the surface. I added a little bit of caulk around the edges and that gave me a nice watertight seal, and it looks way nicer than that one did before it, and the water will have a place to go if it ever leaks out. Now from here I could reinstall my quarter round molding and my carpet transition. Since this is a floating floor, just make sure to nail into the baseboards and not into the floor when you're putting on that molding. And I cut the vinyl transition piece to size and I seated it in that metal U-channel that I installed earlier with my mallet.